At the last minute, he changed his flight plan to get on U.S. Flight 427. He leaves behind both a sister and a daughter.
You just pray he wasn't on it, and then we found out that he was supposed to take a different flight. So, you know, it relieves you when you feel better. And then confirmation came at, what?
About 1:30.
1:30 in the morning, and he was on that one.
I like it when he comes home from work and says, "Hey, girls, you know, how's my girls, you know? So what's for supper, you know?" He just was a typical dad that was loving. He loved us. He'd do anything.
Now to the question of cause. Obviously too early to make any definitive determinations. We may hear later this evening at the National Transportation Safety Board briefing what they have found as regards the all-important black box voice and data recorders. Those recorders we now have pictures of. They were recovered, and they are now in Washington and being analyzed by the Federal Aviation Administration. We are told that perhaps as early as this evening they may have some preliminary indication from those recorders as to just what happened to USAir Flight 427. Obviously that whole question is on the minds of those who run the airline as well, among them Seth Schofield, the man who is the CEO of USAir. It is no secret, perhaps, that USAir has had now 5 airline crashes over the course of the past 5 years. It is perhaps also no secret that the airline has been in some financial difficulty, losing as much as $350 million last year, and according to the CEO himself, another $350 million perhaps this year. Is there any relationship, he was asked, between the crash of USAir Flight 427 and the airline's financial difficulties? He had this to say in response.
I feel very comfortable on USAir. I would feel comfortable with it, with my family on board the airplane. I say this very sincerely. If I thought that USAir was an unsafe airline, I would put the entire fleet on the ground today until it was fixed. I do not.
Seth Schofield, the chairman and CEO of USAir. We will continue to be here and effort the National Transportation Safety Board briefing for you along
the ground last night, 7 miles away from the airport in Pittsburgh. Reporter Ezra Pound brings us the very latest.
Flight recorders recovered from the wreckage of USAir Flight 427 are already in Washington. But assessing what's on them is only half the challenge facing the National Transportation Safety Board. Investigators continue their search for clues at the scene. It's a daunting task since the crash site is heavily wooded and the Boeing 737 disintegrated on impact.
We have begun our site analysis, which, as you might imagine, becomes very detailed. We visited the site this morning. We will begin to divide it into grids and to do some very exact plotting of the wreckage pattern.
The crash of Flight 427 is being called America's worst plane crash in almost a decade. This is USAir's 5th major air disaster in as many years, but federal authorities say they've investigated the airline and found no common thread among the accidents.
Whenever there is an airline that is facing financial challenges, or if there is any other cause for us to increase our surveillance of an airline, the standard practice of the FAA has been to increase our surveillance.
We have not seen or turned up any unusual circumstances in the day-to-day operations of USAir, and we deem them to be safe. In fact, this afternoon I will be flying on USAir.
That report from Ezra Pound. But joining us now live from the crash site is reporter Dale Solid. Dale, what's being done for the families of victims there?
The families, Jim, have been, frankly, nowhere to be found. They are isolated, they are in seclusion now, and the people who are handling this aspect of the crash are making sure that it stays that way. I'm in a staging area in a small strip shopping mall about a half mile from the crash site. It's down just over the line of trees behind me. There has been talk here that the place was very crowded, Jim, last night, and a lot of people are thinking that perhaps the pilot of that plane saw that he was in trouble and swerved intentionally to avoid the lights and the people here in the shopping mall. We're not going to know anything about that until, as Ezra pointed out, those flight recorder tapes are finally listened to and analyzed. But the feeling here, I can tell you, we've had a whole stream of officials in and out. David Hinson, the FAA administrator, Pennsylvania Governor William Casey, all talking about how horrible and how terrible this is. But as far as the city of Pittsburgh is concerned, this truly is like a death in the family. They've got a big vested interest in USAir. USAir to Pittsburgh is almost like Delta is to Atlanta. It's a big part of the local economy. Many people from the area work there. They've made their careers there. Their fathers, their mothers, their sisters, their brothers and husbands all work for the airlines. This truly is the feeling that we're getting here today, just like a death in the family.
How is the recovery effort coming? Have they managed to get that road back to the crash scene, and are they in fact able to bring any of the bodies out yet?
They have set up a temporary makeshift morgue in one of the military hangars over at the county airport here. But frankly, what they've told me already is they're going to go over this ground inch by inch. There are going to be legal cases. There are going to be insurance claims to consider. They don't want to miss a thing. But the toughest firefighters, the toughest police officers have come down off that hill, and they've been shaking their heads. Counseling is now available for virtually anyone who wants it.
And it may be needed. Dale Solly at the crash scene, thank you very much for being with us. Now, if you know someone on USAir Flight 427, or you need more information from USAir, here is a number that you can call. It's area code 703, the number 418-5100. Again, area code 703-418-5100. Now, if that line's busy, you can try to call the toll-free reservation line. That number, 1-800-428-4322, 1-800-428-4322. They can then transfer you to that information line. Tragedies like this can make you think about what it takes to survive a plane crash. In this case, none of the 132 people aboard the flight had a chance. But there are cases when knowing what to do in an emergency can save your life.
Evacuate the aircraft.
The call comes for passengers inside a mock cabin to evacuate during a simulation we videotaped a few years ago. The cabin is filling with smoke and lots of noise.
The smoke-filled cabin, we want them to be at arm rest level.
The people who've been through it say if this was a real crash, the smoke would be black and the noise deafening.
Good exit, come this way, jump and slide. One at a time, armed out front. Let's go, hustle.
Instructor Jeff Ross is running the show. It's a once-a-year refresher course the FAA requires for all flight attendants. Now, he says in a situation like this, panic sets in, and it may be hard to hear the instruction, so it's a good idea to be prepared. If there is smoke in the cabin, bend down and stay low as you make your way to the emergency exit.
We want them to take off their shoes if they can, but in a time like this, our main concern is getting them out and getting them onto the slide and out of the way.
Okay. Occasionally, passengers might have to wrestle with the emergency doors, so it's important to read those instructions before your flight leaves the ground. That way, if you need to know how to do it, you'll be ready. Now, the experts say the best thing you can do is listen to those emergency instructions the attendant gives you before the flight.
Plus why would an Atlanta area man go to plane crashes, and what's his job? I'm Jay Ariano. I'll tell you coming up next.
Plus, the crash does not help USAir's image. We'll examine how it may affect the airline's financial future. And he won't...
Literally, small remains of the human beings that were aboard that plane.
September 9th, 1994, the crash of USAir Flight 427. 132 people were killed.
Dedicated, determined, dependable. This is Channel 5 Eyewitness News at 6.
Good evening. I'm John Marler. Brenda Wood is on assignment. It is difficult to comprehend, even for people whose job it is to deal with such tragedies. Not far from the Pittsburgh airport, tiny pieces of bodies and airplane litter the ground. Tonight, investigators move on to the grim and difficult jobs that follow a crash of this magnitude. Flight 427 originated in Chicago. After a stop in Pittsburgh, it was to go on to West Palm Beach, Florida. Investigators are beginning to study the information contained in the aircraft's flight data and voice recorders. We may get some preliminary results tonight, but it could take weeks before investigators have any conclusive answers. And coroners are removing bodies and pieces of bodies, trying to make identifications. Let's go now to the scene to Elizabeth Kaleden. She has the very latest from the crash site.
Overnight, the small community of Hopewell Township, Pennsylvania, has been transformed by having the dubious distinction of being the site of the deadliest air crash this country has seen since 1987. Now, what makes this crash particularly disturbing is that it seems to have no obvious cause. That has investigators scrambling for answers and transportation officials trying to calm growing fears about flying. This is all that's left of USAir Flight 427, a burned-out crater in the woods of Hopewell Township, Pennsylvania. The crash site seems small compared to the scope of devastation. 132 lives lost, the Boeing 737 in splinters. Pennsylvania Governor Robert Casey toured the site by chopper.
Just a horrifying scene of destruction. And it's the most poignant and impressive part of the whole scene is the fact that there are 132 human beings down there that perished in this tragedy.
In the light of day, the coroner and National Transportation Safety Board investigators began the task of combing the wreckage inch by inch.
There was evidence of fire at the site, a relatively compact impact area, but more than that, to draw any conclusions at this point would really be speculative.
The plane's flight recorders were found early on and are being analyzed in Washington. But along with the mystery of what caused this crash are nagging questions about USAir's safety record. This is the airline's 5th crash in as many years. But FAA Administrator David Hinson and Transportation Secretary Federico Pena were quick to defend USAir and air travel in general.
To this point, we have not seen or turned up any unusual circumstances in the day-to-day operations of USAir, and we deem them to be safe.
I want to emphasize that the U.S. airline industry is the safest in the world. Our national airline system has had the highest safety performance in many years.
That may be cold comfort to the relatives of people who died here. They will be wondering, if the U.S. airline industry is the safest in the world, how could this happen? And at this point, that question remains on investigators' minds as well. While the flight recorders may yield some immediate preliminary data, it may be weeks or even months before we get some hard answers here. Reporting live from Hopewell Township, Pennsylvania, Elizabeth Caledon, CBS News. Now back to you.
Elizabeth, as you noted, last night's crash was the 5th in 5 years involving a USAir jet. 231 people have died in those accidents. The most recent was 2 months ago in Charlotte. A DC-9 crashed on approach during a violent thunderstorm. 37 of the 57 people on board were killed. In March of 1992, a USAir jet crashed in a snowstorm at New York City's LaGuardia Airport. 27 people were killed. Investigators say the plane was not properly de-iced. In February of 1991, 34 people died when a USAir jet collided on the ground with a smaller plane in Los Angeles. Both had been given clearance to land on the same runway. And in September of 1989, a 737 crashed into the East River after taking off from New York City's LaGuardia. 3 people died. A USAir spokesman says no common thread has been found in any of those crashes. Now, if you think you know the line, that number is on your screen, area code 703-418-5100. Given enough time and enough reconstruction of the accident scene and data from flight recorders, investigators may find out what caused the crash of Flight 427, but for now, there's the devastation to deal with, the wreckage and the loss of human life. Channel 5's Jim Kazurski is in the newsroom as we continue our coverage of this tragedy near Pittsburgh. Jim?
John, sometimes it takes many ambulances, fire trucks, and police cars, and their flashing lights have made up most of the pictures from Pennsylvania. No rescues were made.
The immediate emergency response of fires and the search for any survivors. As I've stated, there were no survivors.
There wasn't much to see from the crash site itself, just a scorched hole in the trees. One man who did walk the ground said the plane was decimated.
The scene is one of absolute carnage. What we have are fragments of an airplane, and we have literally small remains of the human beings that were aboard that plane.
One eyewitness said the plane, from an altitude of 800 feet, nosed straight into the ground.
What happened basically with the plane was flying at a very low altitude, anywhere from 800 to 1,200 feet. No sign of problems whatsoever. In an instant, it flipped over. And when it flipped over, there was no sound of an engine. And it basically stopped in midair. Nose went down to the ground, and it fell out of the sky with the nose down.
A medical team was helicoptered into the crash scene. There was nothing for them to do.
There was really no recognizable parts, not only of the aircraft or the baggage or luggage that was on board, but very few recognizable parts or body parts.
The area of the crash was so remote and rugged, heavy equipment was brought in to clear a road. Still, some tried to make their own way in.
We had the road checkoffs fairly done, but we literally had people going through the woods and climbing up cliffs and crossing four-lane highways to get to the site. I don't know why what the reason was for that they learned their lesson with an arrest.
It has got to be oh so tough for the families of those who died. Jim, thank you very much. A major crash like the one in Pennsylvania is something we have never had happen at or near Hartsfield Airport. There is, however, an Atlanta man who has experience in the difficult and grisly task facing investigators right now. Channel 5's Jay Ariano is at Hartsfield, and he has that story. Jay?
As we've mentioned, Atlanta's Hartsfield International Airport has never seen an accident the scope or magnitude of yesterday's crash. But there is a man from Atlanta who has seen several disasters. It is his job to go there and sift through the carnage, the rubble, and the pieces, and the grim task of identifying the victims. From above, the devastation is total. The crash scene immense. No one survived the crash, and now the grim task of identifying the victims is up to people like Dr. Joe Burton. Dr. Burton is the Cobb County medical examiner, and he has been called upon to untangle the human wreckage in some of this country's worst air disasters. Dr. Burton is the Cobb County medical examiner, and he has been called upon to untangle the human wreckage in some of this country's worst air disasters. Dr. Burton is thankful that this is one accident he won't have to put his talents to use.
Maybe there will be even some where facial identifications can be made. There will be some where fingerprints can be taken from hands or from things like that where there may be fingerprints on record. So there will be some parts of bodies that you can document were people that were on this plane. The difficulty is that they may not ever be able to put back together a single body other than the one that's been described as a child's body that seems to be intact.
Burton has been on the scene for accidents in 1973, 74, and 77, all he describes as devastating. But he says never before has he seen carnage to this extent.
It's an impossible task. It will be probably easy to identify that there were certain people on the plane. There will be enough parts of bodies or bodies that have held together enough to have dental work that can be looked at, or maybe there will be...
Burton also tells us he has seen a number of smaller crashes, but he said the sad thing in this accident is it could take a team of people weeks, even months, to identify the victims. And he said, even more sadly, some of the victims possibly will never be identified. Reporting live from Hartsfield International Airport, I'm Jay Ariano, Channel 5 Eyewitness News.
Jay, thank you. The crash of Flight 427 comes at a time when USAir is struggling to recover from years of financial losses. That's also part of watching what happens. The chairman of British Airways told Channel 5's Morse Diggs he is looking for assurances the company will be strong financially.
The USAir financial data file. The carrier is headquartered in Arlington, Virginia. It has lost money for 5 years, since 1989, with losses of some $575 million over the last 18 months. The British Airways chairman, whose company has a stake in USAir, says the latest financial quarter showed signs of a turnaround with a small profits.
Our people have been working very closely with USAirs for the past couple of years, and we have a very high regard and respect for what they do.
And his message to airline customers?
All airlines treat safety first and foremost. It is absolutely paramount for airlines, and I have every confidence in the safety standards of USAir.
With respect to the financial condition, I can assure you that while we have gone through some very stringent cost-cutting measures at USAir, there have been no shortcuts whatsoever with respect to airworthiness.
USAir Flight 1240 leaves at 7:51. Changes in Charlotte, arrives at 10:27.
We checked with Atlanta travel agents to see if there's been any immediate impact on the bookings of USAir, and also to see if the series of disasters could have a negative impact on the carrier's long-term bottom line.
I've had people making remarks about it. I have personally not had anybody call and cancel flights or change their plans.
Channel 5's Morse Diggs reporting. Let's wrap up for now our coverage of the USAir disaster. All 132 people on board
involved the same cause. 2 months ago, a USAir jet crashed in North Carolina. Suspected cause, wind shear. 37 people died. 2 years ago, a USAir jet crashed on takeoff in New York. The cause, pilot error. 27 people died. 3 years ago, a USAir jet collided with a commuter plane on a runway in Los Angeles. The cause, air traffic control error. 34 people died. The company insisted today that these crashes do not mean it is being lax on safety.
There does not appear to be any thread that ties them together. So while they each, in their own sense, are very tragic, we do not believe that there is a thread of an issue here with respect to safety.
But a safety expert said USAir should analyze its procedures anyway.
I think they've got to start an internal safety effort that really gets down into the nitty-gritty and ask themselves the tough questions about safety. Are we doing everything we can to try to prevent these accidents?
The safety board says it will issue a finding of fact in 3 months and declare a final conclusion in 7 months. Until then, what caused the crash of USAir Flight 427 remains a mystery. John Martin, ABC News, Washington.
And just a little more on this. Joining us this evening from Seattle, Washington, home of the Boeing Corporation, incidentally, is John Nance, aviation analyst, writer, and 737 pilot. Mr. Nance, are you surprised that there is no indication of anything from the cockpit beyond that word, emergency?
Not really, Peter, because if this crew had their hands full trying to save their lives and save their airplane, they wouldn't have had time to push the button and talk about it. Matter of fact, any transmission was probably a result of just squeezing the switch on the yoke.
So it was an accident, in other words?
Probably was.
Yeah. There's enormous frustration, of course, about the cause of the crash. Is it possible that in some cases like this, we're never going to know what happened?
It is possible. We may never know what happened in Colorado Springs, and even though there are only gross similarities, and I agree there's virtually no basis to pull these two together, we may never know here, although I think we've got to wait until the voice recorder comes out and the first early indications are in.
In the fact that these two aircraft here in Colorado Springs rolled a bit, do you see any clues?
I see a lot of chilling, worrisome things because airplanes aren't supposed to do this. These jetliners are not supposed to act like this. But no, I don't really see anything other than a gross similarity, and it is really much too soon to begin drawing strings between them.
Okay, thank you very much, John Nance.
Which was the same type of crash and the same type of aircraft. Now, I know it is speculation on your part, but you're a pilot. If someone pressed you and said, John, what do you think is probably the most likely thing or where we should look first to explain how a plane would do something like that, what would you answer?
Well, I would answer that you look at the flight data recorder, you find out what the parameters were of how fast he was going, where the airplane was aimed, what the engine speeds were, and then you can begin to gain a picture. I really think we're going to get a lot of information out of the flight data recorder.
Let's go to Michael Goldfarb. And Michael, let's ask you the same question. What is your best guess as to what would make an airplane do something like that? Not simply the engines go off, but go into a roll and then dive straight into the ground.
Pat, I'm neither a pilot nor an NTSB expert, and I think that I'd like to avoid all speculation. I know that the public and everybody else wants to quickly get to the cause, and I know that that's a very painful process with something as traumatic. I was 7 years ago at the last major crash at Northwest Air with the NTSB touring the site, and I'll tell you that when you're on site and you see the devastation, you want rapid answers. And I think that the best thing we can do is avoid the speculation. Let NTSB, let the FAA do their investigation.
Michael, then let me follow up on this. USAir stock fell 10% today. It has been losing money, I believe, on and off for the last 5 years. We now have what looks like, I mean, it's the causes of the crash that they've had are all different. But it looks like, 5 crashes in 5 years. Do you think this is going to be a near fatal blow for the airline?
The government's concern is the margin of safety, and are we certain that the pressures on an airline in today's environment don't erode those margins of safety? I know that FAA has a rather aggressive surveillance and monitoring program on USAir, given these 5, what seem to be at this stage unrelated instances. So I think that what it means in the marketplace is really yet to be seen. And I think we need to find out what's going to become the root cause or causes of this crash before we can make those kind of judgments.
Okay, our third guest
let me get into that question.
All right, go ahead, Mr. Nance.
I was just going to say that I agree entirely. Matter of fact, I'm glad to hear him use margin of safety. That's a term I helped popularize in '86.
Explain what it means, please.
It means the point at which you have an ability to absorb anything that goes wrong without it becoming an accident. The buffer that's in there. That's why we have 2 pilots and not one.
How much
sometimes.
the plane can twist and turn before it breaks and that sort of thing.
But he's right about USAir in this respect. There is no similarity. There's not a scintilla of similarity in these accidents, and there's just nothing to indicate that USAir has any flaw in it that has been creating this sort of problem. I've been looking at it. I don't see it.
Okay, let's go to our third guest now, who is Wesley Smith. He's co-author with Ralph Nader of Collision Course, The Truth About Airline Safety. Mr. Smith, let's just lay it out on the line. Is flying safe?
Yes, flying is safe. Before we go any further, I think we should all agree on one thing, that we express our sympathies to the families of the victims. And I'd also like to express our thanks to the people who are out there.
Biohazard plan